Merci beaucoup, Felwine. Thank you for your lecture. So we're looking forward to the conversation with Nana and Felwine, hosted by Aïcha Diallo. Welcome, Aïcha. Let me briefly introduce you. Aïcha has been head of education and outreach at the Museum das Minsk in Potsdam since November 2020. As a cultural scientist, educator, freelance writer, and editor, she has collaborated on various projects, amongst them the art magazine Contemporary End, the Biennale Dak Art, Kontextschule in Berlin, the Pan-African cultural platform Chimurenga, Cape Town, the Label Noir performance platform, and many more. Her research and teaching interests are trauma and memory studies, critical pedagogy, and post-colonial critique. Her full-length biography can as well be found on our blog, Talking Objects Lab. So, Aïcha, I wish you three a nice conversation, and all of us, so the floor is yours.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Nana and Felwine, for your amazing lecture. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing this space with us physically at the Akademie der Künste in Berlin and also digitally around the world. And we're also closely connected to Nairobi. Hi, Nairobi, the colleagues in Nairobi. And I also would like to thank Isabel, Mahret for this generous invitation. Thanks also to Selina, Matthias, and the rest of the team. Thank you for your great work. As I believe that decolonizing practices have proven to be a collective project, I'd like to somehow to start off the conversation to throw in some kind of inspiration, a quotation by scholar Wendell Hassan Marsh. I'm going to read it out loud. Please listen. Because memory is so often developed from non-written texts, these narratives are more difficult to trace because of the scarcity of traces. But deep in the ideologies, practices, and politics of the denied history is an ethereal, yet very real memory that is unstated, but nonetheless destatic. In other words, history is the science of the state, while memory is the art of the stateless. So what we are going to discuss today in this half an hour, we're going to connect both of your practices, Nana and Felwine, how you are deeply connected between art, music, theory, writing, teaching as well, curating, spirituality, which is quite actually part of decolonizing knowledge and memory. So how to decolonize, what does it mean actually to decolonize memory and knowledge? And also when we talk about sound and music, how to breathe through the archive, how to breathe through cultural archives. And the body, what does it mean? When we also talk about trauma, colonial trauma, racial trauma, and because we are in this performative space, just also by being here, and we also talk about performance, the role of performance, what does it mean to sense and get a sense of vulnerability? And also, we can also ask ourselves the question, how can we create spaces of belonging, spaces of repair, spaces of healing? Okay, thank you so much, Nana and Felwine. It was incredible. I'd like to draw in again this notion this practice of music, the role of music, and I like to look back, because we talk about memory. So, how did music affect you in your childhood, actually?
After you.
No, I just have to, so you can start.
You go first. I have to think about it.
Okay, probably I would like to. I think music leaves a trace in the psyche, and a sensible trace. And what is interesting is that this trace is not, at first glance, a rational, trace. So you don't have to think about it. You just have to remember, to taste it, to feel it, and to experience it. And I think what is very interesting in this space of music is that it allows for, I will say, a total experience, and not a distant experience. You immerse, when you are listening to music, you're immersed in the space that music creates, and it's an unlimited and an unbound space. So for me, it allows a different phenomenological experience that is not always trying to put a distance with your reason, because we've been trained to do that, to separate the beings, the subject and the object, and to reflect on something. So it's a kind of art of participations. You are in something that moves, and I think probably this epistemic quality of music is important in the way of thinking how to be able to reinvent the ways of knowing. And knowing is not just always separating and reflecting and finding the reasons or the rationality of things and linking them and being able to explain, all this way of knowing that we have learned through schools that seems obvious, normal, but that became hegemonic and dominant. It's just the problem. There is a plurality of way of experiencing and knowing, but one of them became the most important and pretend sometimes to be the only one way of relating to things. And I think just diving through the musical space allow this idea of being able to know differently and probably to highlight what are the specific forms of intelligibility that music brings. And just what about what you were saying about history and memory? A lot of human societies, they have their history in their oral history, and they transmit it through generation. And orality is a very safe way of transmitting things. This idea that orality is a more vulnerable archive is not true. All the archives are vulnerable, have their failures. But there is a way that society, preserve the oral transmission by techniques, and also deal with this idea of the memory and the oblivionism, because society don't transmit all the cultural matrix. They choose what they think that it's worth to be transmitted, and they decide to leave something and forget something on the road to open the space for invention and creativity. So the idea is not to keep all the archive and to bring them to the next generation, but to see what is a living archive, what is important to be transmitted, but also to leave the space to reinvent. And songs are very important for that, because they draw on an ancient archive, but they leave space for reinventions through that. I will leave it here.
Thank you. I want to pick one of the statements you said about music. Music helps to unlock your own soul. Maybe you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, actually. But I also want to answer the question about the childhood of music, because when I was thinking about it, it's quite a complex question for me, because my dad was really into Western classical music. So I think of my childhood as that. My mum was really into Doris Day. When we went to family parties, especially my mother's family parties, which were very loud, there was all the kind of Ghanaian old music, which when I hear now has a very emotional reaction to me. And then when I went home to my hometown, when I think of my childhood, I think of this cacophony of drums. So music has a very, very multi-layered sensory memory for me. But yeah, anyway, to go to this thing of the... So the diagram that I showed you was a kind of symbolic depiction of the Hoyewe system, which is a kind of fully formed knowledge system of which music is a very, very important part of the transmission. And you know, I've been working with the knowledge keepers of this system for quite a few years now, but I'm still very, very much at the tip of learning about it. And I always ask them, you know, can I have more lessons? I'll be talking to them on the phone and they'll be like, this is a lesson. And a lot of the lesson is actually about the purification of myself, if that makes sense. Like, I can't even approach this knowledge system until I've reached a certain level within myself. And so the outcome of this form of music was, first of all, it's not passed on to immature souls. There's only the people who are allowed to sing these songs, who are allowed to engage with this music, are people who have prepared themselves, who have awakened to certain spiritual states. And I mean, yeah, it's so complex that, like I say, I only begin to understand it. But they say that the cosmos, that objects are organized by vibration, sound, light, color laws, and they're symbols that mark the boundaries of these things. And these laws are together all called Musa. And only if you recognize the Musa within yourself can you begin to recognize the symbols. So I'm not even at a stage where I can recognize the symbols yet. Yeah, it's all about starting with yourself, hearing your inner music, cultivating that before you can begin to hear the outer music. Yeah, and it's yeah, and wait, one thing that I love that they said is that knowledge is not just a mental activity, but it's an act of love, and that the unification of the soul of a being with the essence of the object, that's the highest level of knowledge, is this unity between subject and object. And I just really love this idea of knowledge not just being this mental activity that you're pushing yourself, but knowledge as an act of love. I loved learning this.
Mm-hmm. Knowledge as an act of love. Felwine, you talk about music as a powerful knowledge and also listening as a way of knowing. And how, because you're also a musician, how do you actually work with you being a musician, doing this research on music, and the other disciplines you are involved? How do you work together?
I think at the beginning I was separating the fields and the discipline, you know, and having different kind of hats. Sometimes being a musician and not reflecting on the practice, just doing it, you know, playing music, touring, recording albums, etc. And at some point in my research in humanity, I tried to bring all these disciplines together. I'm teaching a class actually where I use music as the main space of knowledge on African societies, on the post-colonial African societies. With this idea that we can produce a political history, a social one, of course, a cultural one of African societies after independence, just by looking through the musical archive. And in the class, we have a practice of listening. You know, before going through the theoretical texts, analyzing what music brings, just having a playlist and listening to the song. And sometimes the songs are sung in African languages, and we have to translate them, or not to translate, just to be at the stage of the vibration, not the understanding of the words and the transcriptions and the meaning or the sense, but just the presence of the musical vibrations and what this musical vibration conveys. So I'm trying to put all together, and I'm trying to avoid, I will say, the bias of my training in the academy. But obviously, I try to theorize things, to use notions to understand. But also I'm interrogating the limits of the theory by using this kind of, and my research is how to find the right methodology of approaching this type of knowledge and not bringing it in a framework that is not the good for better knowing it. But what helps me is that I already had an experience as a musician doing long years, without reflecting. So I can feel if I'm at the right place or not. But I just want to jump on what Nana said about this knowledge she's trying to seek through a personal and spiritual purification process. In a lot of African epistemic societies and community, so you have kind of initiations to know, an esoteric knowledge, with this idea that knowledge is not something that you are going to get outside from you. And knowledge is produced from the interaction of your beings and things. And in some Australian indigenous community, you can't know things if you are not in presence with them. So you can't know them if you are not here. And the knowledge emerges from the quality of the relation and the presence you have. So it's interesting to saw that there are a type of knowledge that necessitate this kind of quality presence or this kind of ontological relations. So it's not just an object that you have to take, but you have to be in relation in a certain way to allow this knowledge to unfold. So I think it's interesting for this idea of decolonizing knowledge to also show that there is a lot of type of knowledge, but some knowledge necessitates also a kind of personal journey. And it's not just arriving in a space where the knowledge is produced and taking it, but you have to go through yourself and build a quality of attention, relation, being, etc., to be able to give the room or the space for this knowledge to arrive. So there is a kind of emergent knowledge that is not already here, waiting, but that arrive when you go through this journey. And I think it's also interesting to, to add it on the plate.
So, in a way, how you actually need, you both talk about this idea of being also self-reflective and as a kind of meditation. So, how it's important to be in dialogue, also part of a community, and not just not extract actually that knowledge and have some kind of respect. So I have to think also about, because we live in a continuum from the past to the present and hopefully to the future. So how do you also think of our ancestors? How do you see how to, especially also in your work with the heritage of drummed poetry, how to dignify this role of ancestors?
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure this idea of the continuum of past, present, future is something that I completely believe in anymore, especially through the research where the present and the past and the future coexist. That this idea of time, as I've been taught it, this idea of linear time, it's almost like you free yourself from it. And yeah, there's literally a freeing. And so I'd like to, obviously I have to live in this world and within these concepts, but I'd like to move more and more into this notion of time as being space, I guess, multidimensional. How do you honor the ancestors?
Yes, like this connection with, because there is a non-linear way of being and of knowing how to actually, honor that.
I mean, how do you not honor them? Because they're in everything, right? So, I mean, everything I do is in communication or in connection with my ancestors. So, in a way, I don't know how to answer the question because I'm not separate from them. They're literally in everything that I do, and they have been since childhood. And I think, I don't know, like I think that's for me, it's a given that they're present. So I don't know how not to honor them in a way, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think also that, this question is also linked to the kind of deconstruction of the subject, in the Western epistemology. This idea that in a lot of cosmologies in Africa, in Latin America, in Amazonians, people are plural. Their ontology is a pluralistic one. People are assemblage, of a lot of things. The ancestors are here; they enact through us, but the links through the different elements. So it's not just me as an individual subject. That is my identity. This idea of an identity that is pluralistic. First, but there is also a metamorphic identity. In a lot of African societies, people can change their body. They can move from an identity to another. So this idea of the subject, the individual subject, also is to be interrogated in this idea of decolonizing identities and knowledge, and also this idea of temporalities: the past, the future, the present. In some African community, the past is in front of you because you already know what is the past. And the future is in your back because you don't see the future. They have totally reversed the temporality. So the temporality are, they are correlate first, but they are totally reversed. And this idea of moving from the past to the future, is not always true.
So the past and the future, and so how all of these entities coexist. And Felwine, you talk about scores in music science. There's also this title of a book called "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. He focuses on trauma, and so I'd like to know how you see also the role of the body, but also if we talk about transmission, how there's also the transgenerational transmission of trauma, colonial trauma. So how would you define that? And also as a kind of contrapoint, how music can actually move through trauma.
I think that music is a space of healing. It's a space of rebuilding the psychic structure that was damaged. There is an Algerian psychoanalyst named Karima Lazali. She wrote a book, The Colonial Trauma, and she shows that the next generation of young Algerians who didn't experience the Algerian war, but whose story about this war were not transmitted through languages, they felt a difficulty of existence. They have this history has an impact on their contemporary subjectivity, even if they weren't there. They didn't know the war, but just the fact that in the family there's a silence, and this story is not transmitted through languages and through imaginaries or through representation. And she's a psychoanalyst, and she had a lot of people who came to see her, and they have psychological problems because of this intergenerational transmission of the absence of the trauma. And for her, the question is, where are the space of cure? How can we heal it? And imaginaries, culture, arts are space for healing that. And the question is that we all carry a memory that is here before us, but we are not limited through this memory. And the question is how to deal with the dispossession we don't know, and how to heal it. But the first stage is to be able to know that there is something that is missing here. There's something there's an untold story. There's a blank, and how this blank operates. And all the artistical practice help to walk through this blank, without acknowledging them in a rational way, but they process. And there is an interesting field of words around how music can help to go through this blank of the memory, even if we don't realize or we don't know that there is something that is missing, or there is a trauma that is here that we don't know.
Yes.
I mean, I think this idea of the body as archive is really interesting. The short clip that I showed of my cousin dancing, he's transmitting so much history within the dance. Obviously, not everybody who goes understands, but those who understand, it's almost like reading a book, watching the dance. So I think the idea of the body as archive, and also, again, starting with the body and kind of undoing a bit of that lie of objectivity, the lie of I'm going in as an objective observer, completely detached and disassociated. Nobody is objective. We all are subjective. We're all within our bodies. And you know, all the kind of chapters of histories and memories that make up our bodies inform what we are viewing or commenting on or researching. So I think this idea of the lie of the objective and the situating oneself, starting with the body. You talked about the idea of bodies carrying trauma. I remember I was in the Royal Archives in Denmark a couple of years ago with... we were looking at the archives of the slave routes with some artists and scholars that were descendants of the people that left. And it was an incredibly, deeply traumatic experience for both, you know, me kind of like who was left behind and them as the kind of descendants of people who were taken. And it was, you know, we were with Danish people as well, but as Chao was saying earlier in the video, there's an absence of that kind of emotional process. Because for us, this is our lives, it's our realities, it's our histories. But then the inverse of that is that, you know, when I go to places like Brazil, and I was telling you about this artist's work, you know, there's a recognition, a physical, a bodily, a visceral recognition of certain ceremonies, of certain sounds, of food. And so I think there's both sides of the coin. You know, in a way, that connection of trauma, but then also the connection of recognition, both of which you feel in the body. And so in that way, the body is an incredibly valuable... I mean, it's valuable, of course, because it keeps us alive, but it's also a very valuable monitor of value. You know, if we listen to it, it speaks so much. Yeah.
If we listen to the body, it speaks too much. So it's actually about embodied knowledge. And I was thinking about, because we're situated here in Berlin. 2 centuries ago, there was the Berlin Conference. We are actually in the West, connected to Nairobi and other places, but we are here. And I was wondering how, because power structures often constrains who can speak and who get to be spoken to. So how can we make sure to also listen, to be attentive to the ones who are the most marginalized outside of our institutions? How can we do that? How can we mediate actually memories?
I think actually the question of decolonizing knowledge, one of the questions in the academies, and more specifically in the Western academies, is how to avoid to extract knowledge from the so-called indigenous people, to frame them in the academic way and to talk on their behalf, and to bring it by decolonizing knowledge. And there's a lot of debate that is going on its relation with the scholars who went to do their field somewhere, and some of them don't really acknowledge that the knowledge they are commodifying in the space of the academy was transmitted by others that are silenced. And they are very interesting experience. There is a French anthropologist named Bruce Alberts. He worked with the Yanomami in Brazil during a lot of years. and he co-wrote a book with David Kopenhauer, and he decided that David Kopenhauer was the author, and he was just the one who was translating. You know, he tried to reverse the relation between the anthropologist and the field. And I know also that there are some space in the academy where they try to hire people from there to be the one who teach or transmit their knowledge, but also transmit it in their own methodologies, not trying to frame them. You know this question of translations, and there is a power dynamic in translation. So I think all these questions are interesting in this idea of decolonizing knowledge to avoid just when we feel that the archive is being, exhausted, to try to renew it with new knowledges that we keep from other culture. We bring them in the classical frame, and we say we are decolonizing. So I think the question is, even if who is talking, what is the frame, where is the place, is academia the place, how to disacademize knowledge, how to bring it outside of the academia, and how to avoid this relation of being the one who talks on the behalf, or to translate the knowledge of the other through my own lens. So I think all these methodological questions are also ethical questions, and they are very important in this tentative or attempt to really open the scope, but not by reproducing the hegemonic power dynamic and structure that are embedded in our ways of knowing or dealing with knowledge or acknowledging what is knowledge. Because you have a lot of knowledge that is just not acknowledged, as knowledge. Because, there is this power of naming and deciding that this knowledge is valuable because it fits through these categories, and this knowledge is not valuable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I also want to add that even though I'm looking at the Ayim, I want to stress that I'm not looking at it in a romantic, nostalgic, this was a perfect way of knowledge transmission and we should go back to it. Because even within these kind of ways of passing down knowledge, there are hierarchies and power structures.
Absolutely.
The Ayim was a method of conveyance that was within the palace. The talking drum is a form of knowledge communication that's drummed by men. Even within the knowledge systems that I'm researching, there are power structures that privilege certain peoples from communicating and from speaking. I have this mobile museum project that goes into communities in Ghana, and that project is an attempt at getting people within the communities to co-curate and to co-create. But again, it's not a perfect project. And I mean, it's something that I wanted to say at the end of my talk, but I ran out of time, was that all forms of knowing are by their nature partial and they're contextual. What in an ideal way will do, every community produces a different way of knowing. And whatever that community is made up of, whether it's, geographical, whatever that community is, it will produce a different way of knowing. But what should be impossible is that one dominates over another.
Absolutely.
And that should be an impossibility, this idea of universality. Mm-hmm. I mean, who came up with that? How can you decide what's universal and speak on behalf of the world? I mean, it's an impossible construct, and yet we've all bought into it, within this colonial context. And so I think, when knowledge becomes a kind of freedom into which we all have the space to gather, that's when knowledge becomes exciting, because that's when we can present these multiplicities of ways of seeing and being. But how we do that, I think, is a tough journey, because obviously we live in a world where we have privilege of access, of platform, etc. And in an ideal world, obviously those with those privileges take with them those that don't. But yeah, we still live in this kind of developmental paradigm where, that's not what's privileged. But I think more and more people are moving towards something else.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much again for your lectures. Thank you so much for your words, for sharing the space with us. That was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you.